Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Perspectivity Podcast. Today, I am here with Brent in your beautiful home, your artistic home, a place that really feels like a home.
I appreciate that.
Happy to be here. You want to just, tell the people who are listening, who you are, what you do, and maybe what's most important in your life right now in this season.
Yeah, my name is Brent Nelson. I live here in Boulder, Colorado, and I work as an energy economist, basically. And important for this season, I'm relatively newly married, a year in, and I think learning how to be a good husband and hopefully working on becoming a father. So that's our current season in life.
That hits me really deep because I'm looking at you and I'm thinking, that's what I want in the next season of my life, is exactly where you're at. So it's inspiring to me. I'm like sitting across from like my dream that hopefully is to be and to come. Have you always, wanted to have a family?
I think I always wanted a partner, right? I always wanted a wife. I wanted a partner in crime. I wanted somebody to share life with, to do life with, to laugh with, to struggle with. It came much later in life than I wanted it to be and than I expected it to be. But, being a father, having kids, I feel lucky in that, when you go through a big chunk of life, wanting to be married, not being married, if I had really wanted kids through most of that season, it would have been really hard to, really want kids and not have the opportunity. But I kind of, in my, early 30s, it started to transition from where it went. It went from, I always assumed I'd have kids to like, now I would like to have kids. And now I'm in my early 40s, so it's still been a while since then. But hopefully it'll work out. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. And we'll see. But like, anytime I watch a movie, and it doesn't have to be a good movie, it could be a terrible movie, it could be an animated movie, it doesn't matter. If there's any kind of like daddy-daughter dynamic, like I'm a friggin' hot mess. Like it's a train wreck. But I'd really like to have a kid. So
wow, man, you're hitting me deep already. That's absolutely exactly how I feel.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. I don't know why. I think, listeners of this podcast know my story. You know a good amount of my story because we've been able to talk. And one of the things I haven't talked about a lot is I had this little sister. She wasn't really my sister, but a nurse who took care of my brother, who had severe cerebral palsy, had a daughter. And I watched her be born. And I was just old enough that she was like a good little sister, but I was still a kid. And we had this beautiful dynamic. I helped her everywhere. I kind of like babysit her. And I just remember feeling so important. Like I mattered so much when she'd look up to me and she'd be so happy, or she'd reach up, and she'd want me to pick her up. There was just this feeling inside I couldn't let go. It's the similar thing to what you were saying about the movies.
Yeah. And, I know it's hard, right? Like there's the fantasy of what it's going to be like to have a kid, right? Your kid's going to adore you and your kid's going to be great and sweet and kind and brilliant and all the things that you hope for your child. But my wife and I have been subscribing to this like parenting blog for a while, because there's this, without going too deep in the nerdiness, there's a lady who's like a data person who's like dug into the studies of all the different like pregnancy and child rearing and like all these different things. And she's got like a big following, and now she has like a newsletter basically that we subscribe to. And there's a lot of posts about how hard it is, like you're not sleeping, your kid isn't eating, your kid's a little shit sometimes, and you're like embarrassed about it. You don't know what you're doing, you are exhausted, it's causing problems in your marriage. Like there's all kinds of hard stuff. And, I know that in my head that it can be hard and that it's not necessarily going to be easy, but, you lean in anyway.
I love that. I haven't found anything very significant in my life that lasted a long time that didn't have some level of pain or struggle.
Yeah.
I love that. Did you like being a kid?
That's a weird question. I guess, like growing up, life wasn't wasn't that complicated. I played football on the street with the neighbors, played video games. Looking back, I think to how little responsibility I had and how nice it was to not have that responsibility. And we grew up in a small town, so we had a lot of freedom to kind of wander, right? So I grew up, also in a generation of not crazy overprotective parents, and so, we'd walk to school and we'd walk down to the park and we'd walk down to the pool and I'd walk down to the pier and I'd go fishing, and we were mostly turned loose all over town. It was a small enough town that like we couldn't really get that far and couldn't get in that much trouble either. I guess we could have gotten in trouble, but we didn't. And yeah, I mean, it was mostly a good time. I had complicated relationships with my siblings, and so my older brother, older sister they were kind of partners in crime, and they were both enough older than me that I was the annoying little brother. And then I had another younger brother with special needs. So he was a little bit in a different category, but the older ones would kind of gang up on me a lot, and so I got made fun of a lot. So that wasn't very fun. But I think my childhood was pretty normal. We rode bikes and swam and wandered around town.
And you grew up, remind me where you grew up?
I grew up in the Bay Area, about 20 minutes outside of San Francisco, in a little small, poor factory town. And my dad was an engineer and worked for the Berkeley City Water Department when I was little, and then started working for an environmental consulting firm after that, also in the Bay Area. My mom was stay-at-home at the beginning and then became a teacher.
That's absolutely wild to me. Everything you just described, I mean, you take the Bay Area out, and that sounds like my childhood. I mean, when you were saying playing football in the street with the kids, playing video, I mean, that was so much of my childhood too. And that fascinates me. It also fascinates me, you mentioned that you had a younger brother who had special needs. Mm-hmm. And I've mentioned to you that I have a brother with severe cerebral palsy. Mm-hmm. And growing up, that was fascinating to me because most of the people around me had no idea how to interact with my brother. So it was like this very strange experience for all of them. And whenever I'd have a new friend over, that kind of introduction to, this is Chris. Chris will grab you. Like my brother, we called it the claw. He would lay on a mat on the ground, and you'd walk through the living room, and that's where he hung out. We couldn't put him on a couch or anything because he'd like wiggle off and fall. Mm-hmm. So he'd hang out with everybody in the living room, and when people would walk by, he would like grab like Adam with his hand. If you ever seen the movie, scary movie, I think it's 2, he calls it like his strong hand. It's a reference from a funny movie, but that's what we called it. And he gets you, and so we always tell him like, all right, now you got to watch out for Chris. He's gonna get you. Like that was a huge part of my life. It became part of a game. It also was very serious because people would make fun of him, or people would make fun of other people with special needs, and I felt like that was never an option for me because I had it so close to home. What was your experience like having that?
I think because my older brother and my older sister they were partners in crime, my younger brother and I became kind of the other pair among the kids. I think in some ways I picked on him because I was picked on, but it felt different to me because I wasn't picking on him out of cruelty. It was just, we'd be playing together and I'd tease him a little bit, pretend I was going to steal his toy or whatever, like that kind of stuff that maybe you do with every younger sibling. But I remember thinking about how I wanted to protect him. So like if anybody ever at his school was ever going to give him a hard time, I'd want to go, beat up those other kids or something. Like, I mean, what was I going to do? I was 7, but but and then like you said, like, hearing other people talk about people with special needs in some form or another, wanting to defend that, wanting to stick up for folks who are at a disadvantage in some form or another. I think that was definitely something that came out of my experience having, a special needs younger brother. He wasn't so severe that like I really felt the need to like, orient people to him when they came to the house. Like most people knew that we had a special needs younger brother, but he could interact, he could talk. It wasn't so severe. I think what's been more complicated has been like trying to evolve that relationship as we've gotten older, and what does that look like? It was simpler when he was 10 and I was 13, and trying to figure out what it looks like now that I'm 43 and he's 40. That's been a much more complicated part of that journey. He's old enough to want to be very independent, but he still needs help in some ways. And so how do you give him that freedom to be an independent adult while also providing the support in areas that he might still need support? And I haven't lived around him in a long, long time. And so I don't necessarily even have the relationship with him that I'd like to have, to where I could be more of a support for him. I think that's been a lot more difficult, is that kind of more recent time in trying to navigate that relationship. Still love him to death, but trying to figure out how has gotten a little more tricky as we've gotten older.
I resonate really deeply with that idea of there's people in our lives that we really do love and we care about a lot, but it's not obvious or clear how to demonstrate that and how to make that happen. And I think that's kind of a secret of humanity, at least in my experience, is like sometimes we really love each other, but we just don't know the pattern. We don't know the groove. Mm-hmm. We don't know the right words or the right actions. Mm-hmm. I mean, how many times have you walked out of a situation where you walked in and you're like, I'm going to be a great loving husband or friend or whatever, and you walk back and you're like, that didn't go like a loving, happy relationship. And so I think that's something I bond over with you, because it's like, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to figure it out sometimes. Yeah. Special needs or not, but it's a unique thing too. I love that. So thinking about that, do you think, this is something I haven't really explored as much, but do you think your experience with your brother, do you think that's common or uncommon? That kind of experience that you had of wanting to protect this person in your life. Do you think that's a common experience that people would have, either where you grew up or even in our country more broadly?
I mean, I think with family specifically, relationships can be complicated, right? Like some people want to protect, some people want to fight. And, kind of depends on how you view your relationship to your siblings. More generally, I think we want to protect whoever's in our bubble, like whoever we call us. We tend to want to protect the people in that circle. And that becomes problematic because, sometimes people in my circle might really dislike that person in that circle. And then the people in that circle look at that person as the person that they want to protect. And then you draw your lines in the sand and you start to battle. I also think, without going on too deep of a political tangent, I think our tendency to protect the worst among the people that we call us can be problematic too. Because, there's some people who I want to protect who are at a disadvantage or going through something that other people can't see. That was an example with my younger brother. Like not everyone could see what was going on with him. And so, I had this extra desire to protect him. But, sometimes your little brother's an asshole, and maybe he shouldn't be protected because maybe he needs to learn the consequences of being an asshole. And I think that becomes a much harder space to be in, is how you think about like the people that are in the group that you call us, who are an asshole in some form or another. And we want to protect them because they're us, but sometimes you need to face some consequences for the decisions that you make. And I think that's a hard thing to let go of.
I love what you're saying. Actually, I'm thinking about that and I'm like, even for yourself, I've taken some time to think about situations where
You've been the asshole?
Yeah, I've been the asshole. I've been the jerk. I've been this, not good person. And I think any reasonable human should be able to find times like that. And I asked myself, like, should I be protected? And part of what I ended up studying in psychology, I've studied a lot about the ego and how we're automatically going to this idea in our mind where we have to create a world where we're protected.
Mm-hmm.
If we did something that hurt someone, even if it was justified or we had different reasons or it wasn't the intention, if it caused them pain, it caused them pain. And that tendency to kind of protect ourselves or protect what's going on, I don't know, what I'm hearing from what you're saying is sometimes that actually it inhibits our ability to learn from the experience and not hurt them again
Mm-hmm.
and be able to grow. I love that. I think it's really important. So thinking about that, you got this childhood, you're hanging out, you're playing with friends all over. Did you have a best friend?
I had, like, there was the guys next door who became like sort of best friends-ish, mainly because they lived next door, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a guy a couple doors down who was younger than me, but we were video game friends. So like I go over to his house, we play video games. And then growing up, I had this best friend who lived down the street, and we were in Boy Scouts together, and our moms were good friends and stuff, and we grew up kind of being pretty good friends and had a falling out later. And then I had a guy like 7th grade, I think we got to be really good friends. 6th grade we became really good friends, and then he moved to Nevada, and I was like, there went my best friend. That sucked. But yeah, I had best friends at different points over the years, and then when I was 13, in between 7th and 8th grade, my family moved from California to Seattle, and that was a rough time to move. That was like starting totally from scratch with trying to make friends, and yeah, it was just starting from scratch in a place that was culturally very different than where I grew up. Where I grew up was a kind of working class, poor factory town. I went to school with a lot of kids from the projects, and that was my world. That was what I knew. I remember one day I went to my friend's house after school, and then I came home later. My sister was like, "Were you hanging out at that crack house?" I was like, "Shut up, it's not a crack house." And I found out later it's totally a crack house. So, I mean, by later, I mean like years later, looking back, like 100% that was a crack house. So that was my environment I grew up in, right? So there was, we were a middle class family. We lived on a middle class street, but where I grew up, middle class was like the wealthier folks around. And then we moved to a suburb of Seattle, which was like stupid rich. And we were the same middle class family, but now all of a sudden we were like the bottom of the economic stack. And so I was like all of a sudden hanging out with all these rich kids who lived a very different life than we did. And it was just a big culture shock. I remember being in 8th grade, and there were kids who were bringing lattes to class because coffee's big in Seattle, right? And I was like, I didn't even know that you were allowed to buy coffee as a child. I thought you like needed an ID or something to buy coffee, because like I also don't drink coffee, but yeah, and people had been skiing since they were 3. They do ski school, they go on their vacations and European vacations over Christmas break, all this kind of stuff. It was a different world. And, the sports that they played were different. Like I didn't play soccer, I didn't play lacrosse, but those were sports there. I didn't go sailing. That was a thing that people did there. I didn't really ski. I'd skied a couple of times, but, skiing was a big thing there. Yeah, it was a different world. But I think anywhere you are as a kid, you can generally find your people and make some friends. I think I was someone who was more like friends with lots of people and never really had one single best friend, which was kind of a hard thing, because like, it's nice to have that person who you're committed to each other, you're going to hang out with each other. And I felt like I was always like just a little bit on the outside, because I was like friends with all these different people instead of being like tight friends with like a narrower subset. But yeah, we had some folks that we had a good time together. We played a lot of football in in the yards, and we played tackle football a lot until we all hit puberty, and then it got a lot less fun because we were a lot bigger and a lot more painful when you got tackled. And yeah, the house we moved into in Seattle had a pool table, so like I had friends over and would play pool sometimes. That was a thing for a while. Yeah.
Wow. That when I think about that kind of life transition, it's funny how you said you went from like, oh, you kind of, live in pretty rough neighborhood, to all of a sudden you're like at the lower part of this bigger neighborhood. For me, I called myself like the richest of the poor kids.
Mm-hmm.
My dad worked factory jobs his whole life, and then boom, he got a job at General Motors,
Mm-hmm.
which you're not rich, but in a small, impoverished town,
Doing all right.
you're doing good. And so he'd work all the time. And so I had the new video games. I had everything I needed, like to have fun. And then everybody wanted to play because I had the new video game consoles. And so I always had people over. But my friends, they got their Xbox or whatever, 2 years from then.
Mm-hmm.
And I was this beacon of like we can all go do stuff. But I also never felt like I was completely like my friends, because I was the one who kind of had the things. And so I was closer to the middle class or the rich kids in the school than it felt like my friends were.
Mm-hmm.
And I always felt like I had to do extra work to prove that I mattered, because I cared about mattering to them. I didn't care about mattering to the kids who had everything.
Mm-hmm.
I had to do extra work in my mind to prove that I deserved them, which shocked me. It was different, but it's because that's what the group was formed around. So I had to be tougher, or I had to be, I had to pick whatever was valued in that group, and that was really important to me.
I think for me, what I saw was that, we were middle class in a poor town. We just didn't really think about money, didn't think about wealth. It was just, we were comfortable, and that was all we worried about, and that was all we thought about. And then I saw the impact when all of a sudden, we're up in the suburb of Seattle, which is like midway between Microsoft and Boeing, and tons of engineers, tons of wealth. I went to church with like a whole bunch of retired Microsoft millionaires, who were lucky enough to be at Microsoft in the early days and were able to cash out. But anyway, so when we're the poor family up there, relatively speaking, again, I'm not trying to claim that I was poor. We weren't poor, but suddenly we became much more aware of wealth and money because we didn't have it, right? We didn't realize when we were in this poor town, like we weren't around people taking European vacations and taking Hawaiian vacations and, going on these big ski trips and whatever else. And, we didn't know what we didn't know, right? There's a concept in political science called the demonstration effect, which is an issue that happens in developing countries where they see the wealth and the material goods of rich countries, but those rich countries are the ones that are producing those goods, and so as a result, you have this like perpetual outflow of resources to get the trappings of wealthy countries. And I saw this demonstration effect, in firsthand when all of a sudden we see all these things that we don't have and never knew about them before, never cared about them before, but all of a sudden, once we're there, we notice them, we feel what we don't have. And I saw my family become a little bit more focused on wealth in a way that it wasn't when we were middle class in a poor town.
What you just said took me back to when I was a kid, going into high school. Oh my gosh, for people who have never heard this story, I've had a ridiculous life. But 7th and 8th grade, if you remember me from 7th and 8th grade, you'll remember this. I was like full on wanting to be a rapper. I had like a backwards hat on everywhere I went. I had a jean jacket that had G Unit on it, Gorilla Unit, 50 Cent. I could rap. I could freestyle rap, at least for my town. And people still tell me I'm pretty good. But I remember that was totally fine. And this wasn't rich clothing that I had. It was nicer than what a lot of people would think, but it was fine because it wasn't the haves. There was this have-nots.
Mm-hmm.
I remember as I went into high school, I was like, you know what? I'm going to try wearing Aeropostale and American Eagle and Hollister And these were like the popular brands at the time. And I was like, I'm going to try some of those clothes. I've never tried them before. And I remember there were a lot of my friends who felt like I was a sellout. And there was this idea that once I made that transition, there was actually an identity formed around never being like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never going to wear American Eagle. I'm never going to wear Hollister. And as soon as I wore that, people who I loved, I mean, people who I felt so close to, the second that happened, there was distance. And it just broke my heart. I didn't understand what was happening, but there was this distance. When you talk about people seeing what they've never, they hadn't had. So in psychology, we talk about upward social comparisons. When you have upward social comparisons, you're looking up to compare yourself, or downward, you're looking at, someone who's got less than you. And what fascinates me is sometimes people look up and they feel bad. And when I'm thinking about what you're talking about, it's like you get to a place where maybe you're the lowest class of the highest class or whatever. And you look up and you kind of feel less than, or like maybe I don't fit in here. But then occasionally people look up and they get inspired.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, that could be me. There's something there that I could have. And it's not out of a pain, like I got to beat them thing. It's like if they can do it, so can I. And it seems like there's a fine line between inspiration and this comparison. That's
an interesting dynamic. I remember I went to an outdoor film festival in Flagstaff, Arizona one time. And, and Flagstaff's a big outdoorsy town. There's a lot of, skiers and mountain bikers and climbers and stuff. And, we're watching these videos of these, like, people doing incredible things, climbing incredible things, skiing incredible things. And I remember this exact reaction. Like, I was sitting there, like, it just made me feel like my life was boring, like it made me feel like, gosh, how much do I suck that, like, I can't do that kind of stuff. I'll never be able to do that kind of stuff. And the reality is I will never be able to do that kind of stuff, because you have to start real young to get to the point to be able to do that. Because you also have to do it when you're, like, young, fearless, and unbreakable enough to, like, not think about how you're not going to be able to walk for a week afterward, even if things go right, But then there's other people who go to those same film festivals and they're just so fired up, to get back on in the climbing gym or to get back on the mountain or whatever. And I remember thinking how distinct those different reactions were, and how fascinating it was that, some people were super fired up about it, and then I was, just kind of feeling like, we're idolizing these people in their life and what they can do, and I can't. So what does that mean? What does that say about me?
I love that you express that. That's something that I think we can all resonate with, having a time where we did have that experience. And I love that you just express it so clearly. Like, it's like, yeah, that's just what it was like. Because I think the secret to that is that you somehow see their story. If you can somehow see their story and you see the significance of their arc or what they did, and it somehow has a semblance of a significance that you have in your own. Because I see, like, a Rocky movie, or they're my favorite movies, the Rocky movies, and I'll watch them. And the new ones, the Creed movies, I'll watch them. And, like, Creed's training for a fight and he's getting ready to go do this, and they do the montage. And in my mind, I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh, I'm going to write the shit out of that paper tomorrow. Like, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to get to the coffee shop and I'm going to sip that coffee and I'm going to look at that screen and I'm going to type the best paragraph or the best. And I think that ability to see the commonality and the significance of those things, it's like when you talked about, you see a movie and you see, a father-daughter.
Mm-hmm.
What is that like? Is that at all similar? Do you look at that and say, oh, that's not what I have? Or do you see something different?
So that one's a little bit different, because it's like, yes, there's an element of, like, oh gosh, I want that connection. I want that, I want that little girl, or that little son, I want that. But it also feels attainable, right? Like, it doesn't feel out of my grasp. I think I'm someone who's not very innately disciplined. We were talking earlier at dinner about, why grad school was such a tough struggle for me, and it's because I just didn't really want to do it. I wanted to go play,
Mm-hmm.
And I've always been someone who's never been good at focusing on one thing, because I want to do all the things. I want to do everything. And I'm never going to be that amazing rock climber because I get bored and I want to go do something else. I want to go mountain bike. And then I'm never going to be the amazing mountain biker because I also want to go grab a beer with a friend, you know, or I want to go to happy hour, or I want to go, you know, play guitar. Like I get reasonably good at lots of different things because I'm interested in lots of different things. I'm knowledgeable about lots of different things. And that's why I wasn't a good academic, because I couldn't focus on one thing. I was like, that's boring. I don't want to be an expert in this super narrow, boring thing. I want to know a little bit about everything, which is why I wanted to work with other people, because I was always learning something new and then going just far enough until it got boring, then I go do something else. And there was a part of me that would look at what some of these folks were doing in these like outdoor movies and be impressed with their discipline, knowing that like maybe I even could do that. I just really don't want to. It's not interesting to me. Like I remember there was one group. There's these two British guys that wanted to climb this crack, and it's known as like the Century Crack. It's like a totally inverted 100-yard long crack that's like really difficult to climb. It's also an off width, which means it's like wider than a crack, but not wide enough for you to fit in. So you have to do all this like weird stuff to wedge. And anyway, so they spent 2 years training in their basement. Like they set up this like little crack on their basement ceiling, and they would just like, you know, for hours a day, climb this little crack in the ceiling back and forth for a couple hours every day for 2 years so they could climb the Century Crack. And you know, they got a video made about it, and people were all fired up about climbing after watching them do this. And I was watching it just like, it seems terrible. It seems like a horrible way to spend 2 years. Like, but I'm also just not a very driven and disciplined person. So, you know, like, what are you going to do with that?
It's interesting when you say that, because what I'm hearing is there's an expectation of you need to become a true expert or a true, you know, master of a craft. Like that's somehow admirable to a greater extent than what's going on here.
I think it's an interesting dichotomy because, you know, I think I do this, and I think many of us do this, and so I'm going to say we do this, even though I'm sure there's exceptions. But, you know, we tend to idolize people who accomplish something great, right? Like whether that's, you know, Tom Brady mastering the art of quarterbacking in football, right? Or whether that's LeBron James or Kobe Bryant. We were talking earlier about, you know, Kobe Bryant and his work ethic, right? Or whether that's, you know, Alex Honnold free climbing in Yosemite, or whether that's, you know, an amazing skier or an Olympic athlete or an incredible musician. And you know, we idolize, look up to, admire people who have that single-minded focus and are able to accomplish something big. But to accomplish something big, to build expertise in a thing, whatever that thing may be, means that it has to come at the exclusion of something else, right? And I really don't like to exclude other things. I want to do everything. Like I liked all the sports. I liked all the sciences. I liked all the subjects. I liked all the friends. You know, I've always had friends in lots of different circles because I liked all the different circles. I didn't want to just be in one circle. And, you know, I like all the different sports. I like all the different hobbies. And I have a friend, Phil, he's referred to as the hobbyist because he's like, even more so than me, he does a little bit of everything. And I think it's, you know, we admire the folks who are able to have that single-minded focus and that single-minded discipline, but it comes at a cost.
Do you think that's an American thing, or do you think that's like a global thing? The admiration of this.
I think at the very least it's a Western thing. I don't want to speak for non-Western, but it seems to be pretty common, at least in Western cultures.
When you say this, what's interesting to me is I've struggled with this like crazy too, because I don't want to just be, you know, in psychology, you can pick a subject area and then you pick your niche. And I created a really good project my first year of my PhD, and it has a lot of promise, and that could be my thing. If I really wanted to, it could be my thing. And I was like, I have no interest in this being my thing. I have no interest in being this thing guy. And I was like, and that's okay. To me, I love psychology. I'm obsessed with psychology. I've been studying it for over a decade at high levels, and feel like I just got started. And that's amazing to me. But part of what allowed that to happen is because it was like I was married to psychology in a marriage I wanted to be in. Like we have a relationship. I think of it as a person. And everything else that I did, I could do it for however amount of time I was doing it with full passion, with full love, with full desire. I mean, if we walked over there and played a board game, I could do that same thing. And when I come back to psychology, it's like I talk to psychology about it. It's like when I go to the gym and I work out, I've made myself a promise that I'd never quit working out when I was 15 years old. I said, everybody quits when they stop sports. I'm going to play the long game. I'm never going to quit. I promise myself. And I really haven't. And when I go to the gym in the morning, it's like this place where everything else that I'm doing, all the new things that I'm doing, they get to come together and be part of it. It's like I've got both. I've got this relationship that's long-term committed, and then I got variety that I'm allowed to throw myself into. And that mix of both is really fun because it's like that this one thing's a part of me, and it does not feel like I'm excluding other things or other disciplines. I might be doing it, it just doesn't feel that way.
And I think, there are folks who, like when you have a passion for a thing, right? Like you probably don't feel like you're excluding anything else. When you're in love, right? You don't feel like you're excluding your friends and whatever else that you're doing, the other potential people you could be dating. You're not thinking about what you're excluding, but you are, right? Like to commit to any one thing is to commit to not other things. You just may or may not care, right?
Right. No, you're right. Are there things in life that I'm really curious about this question, this idea of zero-sum beliefs? Are there things in life that if you do them, you're not sacrificing something else?
I don't think sacrifice is the right framing, right? Because sacrifice it has this notion of a painful unwillingness to give something up.
Oh, I like that.
But I think the choice to do any one thing is a choice to not do another thing, because we don't have infinite time, right? One area this actually comes up that I get really frustrated about is when folks talk about balancing family and career, right? And where I get frustrated about it is that it's almost always framed as a problem for women, for mothers. And I'm not saying that it's not. It absolutely is. But as long as you frame it that way, you're already presupposing that men don't have that same trade-off. And when you presuppose that men don't have that same trade-off, you're assuming that it's not a sacrifice for them to focus on career at the expense of family. And it may not be a sacrifice. They may be totally fine with that, right? But to the extent that they're totally fine with that, it's kind of a problem. We're reinforcing this notion that career is men's work and family is women's work, and women have to figure out how to balance this and men don't. And I think that's crap. And as long as we keep framing it that way, we're reinforcing this division of labor. Because the reality is that to focus on career is necessarily going to be time that you don't spend with your family.
What I love about what you just happened there, I love how you define sacrifice and you made the distinction. This hit me deep when you did that. You defined sacrifice as having this emotional component. You're letting go of something you don't really want to sacrifice. And then you used it in reference to men having to sacrifice. And so I just want to pull that out. I get excited about language. That was poetic, the way that experience happened.
Well, and to be clear, my point is that for many men, it's probably not a sacrifice, right? But to the extent that it's not, that's part of the problem, right?
Because you're not motivated anymore. You've accepted that, so much so that you're not motivated. I see this a lot. Actually, I see people not get excited about aspects of their life. They cut their expectations about certain areas of their life so that they can not be plagued by the fact that they're doing something other than what they'd want to be doing. Does that make sense?
You mean kind of like you reset your expectations so that you don't experience any conflict or letdown?
I hear people literally, part of what I do is I'm a high performance coach. And my job there is to help people achieve high performance, which we define very specifically. It's be in the top 15% of your career field while maintaining exceptionally high levels of well-being and high-quality relationships. That's high performance. If you have one of those to the exclusion of the others, it's not there yet. And it's not something you always have. You can, but I mean, it's not always easy to do that, but it's the idea that that's the goal. The goal is this kind of either balance or holistic approach to life. And I love that because I hear people say things like, well, yeah, like 8 to 5 is work time, and that's work's time. I give that time to work, and then I get my time. And for me, I'm like, because I'm actually very aware of what you said, I'm like, no. I'm like, well, if 8 to 5 is a time where I'm going to a job, well, what about lunch? What about my 5 or 10 minute break where I stand up? That time can matter too. And I see people like just shut off expectations from 8 to 5, and that's just how it is. Or vacations. I get 3 paid vacation weeks a year or something, and that's like my vacation weeks, and that's what I do, and that's it. And it's like they shut the expectation they could ever have a better life off because they don't see a way out of what they have to do, and they probably do have to do it, at least at that time in their life. So they slowly shut the expectations off for what life should be.
Well, I think, I saw a webinar one time where the speaker, someone was talking about how work-life balance is a false framework. It's a false construct. Because the reality is that what you should be doing is a multi-objective optimization, right? And I'm an engineer, so I pretend to be one. But that language of optimization is really about trying to say, like, how do you maximize across multiple variables? And if you think about work-life balance as like a teeter-totter, then you're sacrificing one for the benefit of the other, and that's your only dimension to move on. Right, but if you think about multi-objective optimization, you can think about, well, I want to have purpose in my work, and I want to have, I want to be a parent to my children, I want to be a spouse to my spouse, I want to be, I want to be respectable in the community, I want to do this, that, and the other thing, I want to have time for my hobbies, I want to be able to play, I want to, whatever. And you can think about how do you structure your life to try to get the best across all of these things. And different seasons of life might look different, right? But the point is, it's not just a one-dimensional movement. It's trying to structure across them all, and there are things that can serve multiple objectives at once, and there are some things that can pull back from multiple objectives at once. And so it's you're trying to navigate a much more complex space, and you talked about 3 variables basically, right? Like healthy relationships. Top 15% in your field, and what was the third one?
High levels of I'd say well-being, and I think of that as positive emotion and life satisfaction.
Okay.
Feeling like a genuinely happy life and a genuinely meaningful life.
Yeah, well, and I think we often will get stuck in the path that we're on, regardless of whether or not that path is serving our multi-objective purpose, right? And I think of this particularly in the context of money, like people. There's a woman who's a professor at, where is she professor? Somewhere. And she did a PhD, like she's an economics professor, and she did a second PhD in theology at Notre Dame. And she wrote a book that was like something along the lines of Thomas Aquinas and economics or something. And I have this podcast in my podcast app, and I saved it. And I told my wife, like, I want to listen to this at least once a year. And it's a long podcast, so there's some that I'm not interested in. But there's a stretch where she talks about how we keep pursuing career progression and money long past the point where it serves our happiness. Because that's the progression. That's the path we're on. That's the path we're supposed to be on. And you get to a point where like your happiness is not constrained by money anymore, and yet you keep making choices that result in more money, but maybe less time. And how much more valuable is time in particular? And that's time that you could use to feed the homeless. That's time that you could use to spend with your daughter. That's time you could use to spend with your hobby. That's time you could use to spend with your spouse. That's time you could use to read, learn something new. It's time that you could use to sleep, whatever it is,
Yeah.
right? But we get on this path where we just keep chasing the promotion, we keep chasing the raise, even though they're not serving our happiness anymore. And when you start reframing, like, the way that we pursue money and the way that we use money, we spend money in ways that doesn't improve our quality of life, and then we do things that we don't enjoy to make sure that we still have enough money to spend it on things that don't improve our quality of life. It's a ridiculous path.
When you think about this, is there a time in your life where you did this?
Not really. So,
What are you using the word "we" for?
Just
kidding. It doesn't sound like you're
the
part of us.
collective we.
Okay, we blow our time and we blow our money, or we do it all for money. It sounds like you might have figured this out.
Well, I mean, yes and no, right? I think I've always been someone who has lived simply and tried to live simply, and tried to be efficient with my money, and have had to, because I went to college on loans and sent back every penny I had to help pay off the loans. And I wasn't living out of a dumpster, but like, I didn't really feel like any of my money was mine, because every penny I had was debt that I could use to reduce my loans, right? And then I went to grad school and earned enough to live, because I was a paid grad student, but not enough to live the high life by any means. And so and so my friends and I had a lot of great times without spending a lot of money. We had great times at potlucks. We had great times just inviting each other over for dinner. We had great times at parties where, once a semester we'd spend $100 on a keg of beer, and we had a great time, and just had a great time without spending a lot of money. And then I was a professor, and not poor at all, but not exactly swimming in money either. And and that was the first time I had, like, grown-up salary. And so I was like, I've spent most of my life having no money, and so I'm going to spend a little bit more, right? I'm going to take trips. I'm going to buy myself a mountain bike. I'm going to do something. And I still lived well below my means and saved a lot, but but at that point I'd also bought a house, and so I didn't feel like any of my money was mine, because I was like deeply in debt. And I bought my house right before the financial crisis in 2008. And so I bought the house, and then 2 months later I was like $100,000 underwater. And so I was like, what the hell? Yeah, so I lived below my means, but let my spending get a little bit looser. And then lately I've been on this kick of, early retirement. So, how do you structure your life so that you save a lot, spend very little, and get to a point to where you have enough that you can not need to keep working. And then at that point, you can still earn money. You can work in your same job if you want to. You just know you don't have to, right? Wow. And you can spend your time however you want to spend your time. Whether that's, I'm going to raise my kids, I'm going to feed the hungry, I'm going to get involved in some nonprofit, I'm going to learn a musical instrument, whatever you want it to be. But the point is, you can make it whatever you want because you have the financial freedom to do so. And so I've been on that kick for a while, and that's kind of made me reevaluate, the slippage, right? Because like you keep making more money, and then you keep getting a little bit sloppier with like what you spend money on. And I look back now still, and I'm like, in grad school, I had these incredible friendships, and we had an incredible time, and we didn't have a lot of money. And in college, we had a great time. That was like one of the highlights of my life, with friendships and all this other stuff. We didn't have any money in college. We were all poor,
It's so funny when you say that. I'm going to be completely honest, and I want to be like clear. This is not a criticism. This is just what pops up in my mind when I hear this. And I don't know why, but when you're saying that, I hear a lot of grad students say that now in the program I'm in. Mm. And you're right, because you're wise enough to know that you're in debt. But what's crazy is when we think about like the background you talk about coming from to where like you were in grad school, like being able to live even in the area where the really, really high class people were, and you say that, my brain is saying, what are you talking about being broke? Like, you're rich because where I came from. But that's also what keeps people poor. Because I watch it time after time. When college students go to school, they take out loans, and they do think, that's my money. Like, that's my money. But I think to myself, why did they think that way? And, you know, I can say in my own life, I made some mistakes with credit cards at one point where I was just like, I'm in grad school and I was justifying expenses. Like, I'll pay money for conferences. And I funded some of my own research, which nobody ever does. But I funded my own projects I wanted to do that nobody else was part of. I funded my own stuff because it mattered to me. But then I also bought too much Chipotle, you know? And I mean, seriously, like too much Chipotle. When I had a girlfriend, it was like I was buying her too nice of gifts for whatever. But that was that mindset where it wasn't that it thought it was my money, but it was so painful to think about how impossible it would be to have money that you kind of just don't think about it. And so I'm listening to your story, and the lesson I'm learning from that is a lesson I think I still even need. So I'm hearing you say, like, I didn't have money. You know, I didn't have X, Y, or Z in grad school, not a lot of money. Professor, I'm not swimming in money. And professors are, I mean, compared to the rest of the population, they're swimming in money, but not compared to Microsoft, like those Microsoft guys. But that perspective in and of itself fascinates me about how you were actually more calibrated to the truth. And I think that's something I don't fully appreciate, I think, because of the way I grew up. But I want to acknowledge that my brain went, because logically you're right, but my brain for a second had to check it. It was like, who is this guy?
Well,
you know what I mean?
I want to be clear too. As a professor, like I was not hurting, right? I mean, I was making a grown-up salary and all that stuff, but you know, not enough to spend freely, right? Yeah. Ultimately, that's the question.
Not responsibly, freely.
To not responsibly spend freely, exactly.
But that, and the reason I say that though is that's something I'm trying to do as I continue taking people's stories. We talk about correcting bias in the field of social psych all the time. Yeah. My role in that is to notice what my brain said. You're an amazing person with incredible morals who lives a beautiful life. Like one of the things, you know, staying in your house and being around somebody, I know it's only a couple days, but you pick up on a lot. And I've met a lot of people in the last, you know, 80 plus people I've stayed with in the last 7 months. And when I'm looking at you, I'm like, man, like if you pass that on, I would say this, if I could have my kids sit here and hear that lesson from you and you were someone they'd listen to, I would be so thankful.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and that's why I want to notice that there's a part of my brain that's confused when I heard you say it. Because I think that's the secret, right? There's these things, these insights, but our brain doesn't want to. You're talking about, oh, you know, I didn't have a lot of money, you know, I was poor, because you were. You understood that all of your money was debt, so that it was not your money. But like, I'm listening to you coming from where I came from, and I'm thinking, you're rich! Like, I'm literally thinking to myself, you've got, first of all, you came from this Microsoft place, you're talking, even the word million, most people where I come from, by the way, they don't know a millionaire.
Yeah, well, I definitely didn't until I moved to the land of retired Microsoft millionaires. That was a new experience for me. No, but yeah, like, you know, in college, it was all like, technically there was money in my bank account, but, you know, my parents had to eat a lot of the loan because there's a limit to how much you can take out as an individual. And so my parents had to take out the rest. And so all the leftover money I was sending back to my parents because, you know, that they were paying that off. And then as soon as I graduated, they were going to hand that to me, right? So that was my debt in the future. And then, you know, in grad school, I think our stipend was like 22 grand a year. And like, it's enough to survive and beyond survive. Like, I never had a problem buying groceries, you know, I never had a problem paying rent, but you know, it's not like we could just go out to eat whenever we wanted. You know, it's not like I could just go take a flight home whenever, you know, that was like, I could do that like once a year, and I did it about once a year. So that's about all I could afford. You know, and I don't want to overemphasize. It's like I'll often sort of glibly say like I grew up poor and spent most of my life poor, and that's not entirely true, right? I never was worried about losing my house. I was never worried about food on the table as a kid, but we were 4 kids, and so even with a middle class family, 4 kids doesn't leave a ton of extra. And then I was in debt in college, and then I was, a small stipend in grad school. Again, not poor, not worried about putting food on the table, but, definitely had enough to pay rent, had enough to pay for groceries, had enough to go out to eat every now and then, and enough to fly home once or twice a year. And it was just enough, right? But it was enough. I don't want to give the impression that it wasn't enough, but it was just enough.
It's funny when you say that, because there was a time in my life, you rewind 3 years ago, and I would hear that, and I would be mad. I'd be mad at you. And I would be mad at you because I would be projecting something onto you. Because I'd be like, dude, like when I look at college, when I look at grad school, I get paid, I think it's like, I can't say, I don't think technically legal. No, actually, people should be able to look up my salary. I'm a public employee. I think you can look it up. But I think it's like between $22,000 and $26,000 a year, and tuition's covered, and all your classes are covered, and literally your health insurance, 85% of it's covered. Now it's going to be, I think, either 90 something percent or 100, I don't know what it is, but it's crazy. When you look at the overall package of everything that's covered, it's like $250,000 over 5 years. And I'm looking at that, and I literally am like, this is insane. Because my perspective was that I kind of grew up thinking, if you really want to, go to college, you're going to have to pay tons and tons of money. And if you want to go to grad school, I thought it was kind of like going to med school, that you're going to have to pay $100,000 or $200,000. And to me, I would never do that.
Right.
So I just wouldn't go to med school. But what I now appreciate about what you're saying, and actually I'm more and more appreciating the fact that because of my background, I didn't understand you actually were poor. Well, what you said, you actually were, though. Like, you were in debt. You were, when they say poor grad student, it's like there's a lot of benefits, and it's really good. And I think it's great. I personally think it's even fair. But it's also true that you're not rich. You're not swimming in money. You're not loaded. And when you come from a background where your expectation is college must cost $100,000, it feels rich to not have a cost for it.
Yeah. Well, it's all relative, right?
Yeah.
So, like, I was rich compared to someone working minimum wage, right? Clearly.
Yeah.
Right. But I was making a third to a quarter of what someone with an engineering degree would be making in industry, right? So yeah, like I've never been in a position where I didn't have enough to live without worrying about paying the bills. But when I say that I spent most of my life poor, what I really mean is I spent most of my life without excess.
Yeah.
Right. And, then I postdoced for a year after grad school and had a postdoc salary, which is like double a grad student salary, which is still not a ton, but I lived on the same grad student budget. So all of a sudden I was like, wow, like I have all this extra money now that I've never had before. And then when I became a professor, I lived on a similar budget and let things get a little bit more sloppy, and was now on a professor salary. And it was pretty good for the area, but again, a lot less than I would have had in private industry. But everything comes with trade-offs.
That's so interesting, because I hear this all the time, that there's this push to go industry. Because when you have a PhD in a field that is very applicable to industry, you can easily make over $100,000. I mean, you can make in engineering, right? I mean, people are out there making $130,000, $150,000, up to $200,000 after 5 to 10 years in the industry.
It depends. And, I think as a general rule, everybody assumes that other people make more than they actually do.
Interesting.
I think that we hear one data point and we think that that's normal, and that might not be a normal data point. That might be an exceptional data point. Certainly salaries are higher in industry. I think the PhD game is interesting just because, basic math tells you that there can't be enough academic jobs for the number of PhDs. If you assume that any professor oversees, over the course of their career, call it 30 PhD students, like that's 30 new PhD students for one professorship. Like that math doesn't work, right? Like people are going to have to be going into non-academic careers. In engineering, it's super normal. There's a lot of PhD roles in industry, so it's not even a strange thing for engineers to go into industry. But yeah, and salaries vary a ton too. I was at a lower level teaching focused university. Salaries there are much lower than they are at a place like Ohio State or a place like Georgia Tech where I went to grad school. So it's not really an apples comparison there either. But anyway, kind of where all that was coming from was, I think because this all started by talking about coaching and this multi-objective optimization versus work-life balance and stuff, and I think there are two kind of key ideas that I think are really important for people to think about. And the first one is that, number one, if you do studies and you ask people how much money do you need to be happy, like how much do you need to be happy, people will almost universally say double wherever they're at now, right? Because they imagine if I just had double what I have now, then I'd be comfortable. But the problem is then you have double, and then you see the people who have double that, and then you want to double that, and you see people who have double that, and you want to double that, and it's this never-ending chase, right? Unless you make an intentional point to step back and say, what do I really need to be happy? Then you'll always compare yourself, and you'll always chase that next bit, and you'll never be satisfied. So I think it's really important just to be able to take a step back and look at what drives your happiness. And that's different for everybody. For one person who, really loves video games, maybe having a good video game console is a key part of your happiness. For someone who really likes food, maybe, it's going to look like that. For someone who really likes a comfortable house, it maybe looks like that. For someone who really likes to host parties, maybe it looks like that. So for all of us, that's a different answer, but you have to be able to identify what it is that makes you happy so that you stop just chasing more, because more doesn't always make you happy.
What if chasing more makes you happy?
Then you're never going to stop chasing.
But what if you're happy doing it?
Then feed that happiness.
I don't know if that's a good idea. I think there's people who are actually, it brings me this question. I think this is a good way to kind of look at it. In life, one of the things that has been a fascinating thing is you mentioned that when you try to do something, like when you go and you choose to spend your time doing something, it's usually at the exclusion of something else because time's zero sum.
Mm-hmm.
Are there things that people are doing in life, right, that they could become happy with that could actually not be a good investment, either for themselves or for other people? Like, are there certain things that you should not allow to be your happiness?
I mean, I think we all make poor decisions, right? Like a simple one is the fact that, like, you put enough sugar in front of me and I will eat it until it's gone. That does not mean that that's going to serve my life, even though it's going to make me happy in the moment, right? And I think there's a lot of things that way. We all have indulgences that are varying levels of damaging to us, whether they're, food that's unhealthy, substances that are not good for us, addictions to any number of things that could affect our ability to hold down a job, to interact with loved ones, to take care of children, to contribute to this world, right? So, like, I don't think that just because you think it makes you happy that it's a itch that you need to scratch. So I think there needs to be some self-awareness, and to the extent that we were talking about this last night, to the extent that to which we're not good at being self-aware, we might need some feedback from the people around us to say, like, hey, maybe that's not a great thing for you, because we can definitely build on healthy habits. I'm not trying to say that, like, we all make good choices all the time, right?
Yeah.
But I think there are things that we think make us happy that make us happy. There are things that we think make us happy that don't make us happy. But as we try to identify, what quality of life is and where quality of life comes from, that's what we should be trying to orient ourselves toward, and recognize that it's different. Oh, and then I was going to say there's two things that I wanted to say. One is that you gotta get out of that chase, because otherwise it's a never ending chase. But the other thing is that, for us, money is a tool for how we influence the world, right, and how we influence our own life. And we should strive to be very efficient with our money, because it's a finite resource, and what we have to do with our time becomes part of how we get the money that we need in order to use the money in the ways that we want to use it. And so, one of the things that drives me nuts is spending money on mediocre food. Like, I would rather spend $50 on a good dinner than spend $20 on a mediocre one. Like, because if it's mediocre, what's the point? Why did I even spend $20 on that? That didn't enhance my quality of life. That did nothing for me, right? And so, trying to get efficient with our money and not piss it away on things that don't enhance our quality of life, allows you to have that much more money to spend on things that do enhance your quality of life, or have that much more money to spend on supporting a thing that you care about, supporting a charity that you care about, giving to someone in need if that's something that you think is important. But when you piss it away on stuff that doesn't serve your interests, what was the point? What was the point of the hours of your time that you spent earning that money to then piss it away on something that's not of value to you?
I love that. I find I'm the happiest when I am wise with my money. The way I do my money is I have 5% of whatever I make goes into this account.
Mm-hmm.
And that account I can do whatever I want with. And it's my profit account. That's what I get paid to do what I want with. And that account is so powerful because I find myself giving the money. I don't spend it very often. It's so weird having it now, even if I have debt to pay off, that account stays there. And then I find I'm more efficient with it. And the one thing I always like is when all of a sudden I get the impulse to give, and I can shoot $25 to that fundraiser, or $50 to someone in my life who has a birthday dinner and I'm not going to be there, but I can Venmo them and say it's on me or whatever. That is something that I'm learning as I do that more. It's really a powerful feeling when you spend the money the way you really want to spend it.
Mm-hmm.
I love that, and that's a core value to me, is to use what I have in life to enhance the quality of the world. And that's huge to me. I want to ask you, it's how I like to kind of wrap these things up.
Okay.
What is a core value or life lesson that you aspire to live your life by?
That I aspire to, or that I actually do?
I'd say that you aspire to. What's the one that you really try to go for? You probably do it sometimes. You probably don't do it always, but what is your aspiration in life in that regard?
I mean, ultimately, I think what I want in life is for the people who are around me, and that could be neighbors, that could be coworkers, the people that work on my team, people I play sports with. Like, doesn't matter. The people whose lives my life has the privilege to intersect with. I would like the people around me to feel like their life is better because I'm a part of their life. It doesn't mean that I'm in any way successful in doing that, but if I die and people show up at the funeral and they say my life was better because of him and here's how, that would be a life well lived. So I hope that happens. I hope that is happening. And that's what I want to grow into and lean into. And to the extent that I'm not doing that, which I'm sure I'm not in many different ways, one of the things that my wife and I have talked about is how I feel like over the years I've gotten more selfish and more self-focused, and I don't like that. I want to be more I want to be someone who, like, when a coworker is going through something, I drop what I'm working on because being there for my coworker is more important. When a neighbor needs something, that I'm there and I'm not caught up with my own busyness. So that's what I aspire to. That's not what I succeed at, but that's what I want to grow in and be better at.
I love it, man. Well, I'll tell you what, I think my life is better from knowing you, and I sincerely mean that. I appreciate
that,
you
man.
sharing the story. Dude, you're a great guy, and you're so introspective that I trust if I took one thing from you, it would be the way that you introspect and you leave more possibilities for your life. You have possibility in your life story ahead, that it's okay for you to grow, it's okay for you to change, even though you understand who you are. Just even what you said there, it's okay for you to grow and develop these types of things. And that to me is really inspiring. And that willingness to have that self-awareness, I think that's really powerful too. It's an absolute pleasure, my friend.
Pleasure, man. Appreciate it.